The greatest delight which the fields and woods minister is the suggestion of an occult relation between man and the vegetable. I am not alone and unacknowledged. They nod to me and I to them. The waving of the boughs in the storm is new to me and old. It takes me by surprise and yet is not unknown. Its effect is like that of a higher thought or a better emotion coming over me, when I deemed I was thinking justly or doing right.
Hi, I'm Dr. Matthew Giobbi, and today we'll be looking at the ancient Greek history of psychology.
The passage that I opened with is from Ralph Waldo Emerson's essays, and it's about the second or third page in his essay entitled Nature. I think that this essay really captivates the essence of what it was like to live 15,000 years ago. As a matter of fact, we had mentioned the oral tradition of mythos, of myth, that preceded the logos or logic of philosophy. And today we're going to look at that moment in time, that transition from the oral mythical culture of understanding to the logical, logos, philosophical worldview of the ancient Greek philosophy. This transition actually took place somewhere around 600 BCE. And prior to this, historians, anthropologists, archaeologists, philosophers like to describe the mythological worldview as one that exists within magic, animism, and anthropomorphism. Now, anthropomorphism is the projection of human attributes into nature, onto non-human things, objects. Animism is the belief that everything is animated, everything has a spirit, everything is alive. And magic is a way that we elicit certain events to occur. We understand them as occurring and attributing beliefs into some sort of metaphysical and supernatural magic. Magic, like science, had the goal to understand, influence, and predict natural events. Listen to this passage from Waterfield. Quote, "All systems of belief evolved to elucidate the order of things and to make sense of the world. In this sense, science is just as much a myth as anything else. It is a framework or a model designed to explain the form reality for those people who accept it, that is, for those people who voluntarily become members of that society, and for only as long as there are enough people to accept it. If this is so, then so far from banishing gods, science has merely been the matrix for a new generation of scientific gods, children of the gods of gods." Theoretical psychologist Nick Humphrey mentions that instead of being called Homo sapiens, we should be called Homo psychologicus, because from the earliest time, even within myths and magical beliefs, the goal of human beings was to understand the motivations, actions, and feelings of others, what today we call theory of mind. Now at this time in ancient Greece, this is around 600 BCE, there were two major religious systems. One was the Olympian religion, and the other was the Dionysic Orphic religion. The Olympian religion was the religion of the wealthy upper class. This was the religion that looked to the Olympian gods, who acted and behaved, and the myths mirrored the existence of the Greek upper class. There was no belief in an afterlife, so the point of this belief system was to live as honorable of a life now as possible. And this logical, honor-based, glory-seeking life was very appealing to the upper class of Greek populace. The Dionysian Orphic religion was appealing to the peasant class, the laborers and the slaves. And it involved Dionysius, who was the god of drinking and wine and sexual frenzy. And this was a more organic, a more charismatic type of belief system that actually believed that the soul existed, that there was some kind of life force transmigrated after death into another life. And this served as an integral part of Judeo-Christian heritage eventually. So these two religious mythical beliefs each had their place culturally within Greek society. And it was really one that appealed to different class structure. We can understand this opening of philosophy, Philosophos, philo, the love of sophist, wisdom, sophist, wisdom, the love of knowledge, the love of wisdom. We can see this as, in a Kuhnian perspective, as the first paradigm shift, the shift from mythos to logos, the shift from magical, supernatural explanations to natural explanations, maybe more accurately, logical explanations. We'll see that metaphysics, or the unobservable and unmeasurable, still play a role in philosophy. The main question that the earliest Western philosophers had was really the question of being. What is the stuff we're made of? What is being? With the little b, with little b meaning the physical being of stuff. What is stuff? As a matter of fact, the earliest philosophers were referred to as cosmologists. Cosmos with the Greek word of universe. This is seeking to understand the big picture, the structure. The first philosopher is usually thought to be Thales. And Thales lived between 625 and 547 BCE, traveled extensively throughout the world in Egypt and in Babylonia, and his interest was in attributing the cause and effect, the understanding of events to physis, to physics, to the natural substance rather than to the whims of the gods. He was also interested in identifying the fundamental structure of all things, that original being of all things. And listen to this passage from Russell. The most important of Thales' views is his statement that the world is made of water. This is neither so far-fetched as at first glance it might appear, nor yet a pure figment of imagination cut off from observation. Hydrogen, the stuff that generates water, has been held in our time to be the chemical element from which all other elements can be synthesized. The view that all matter is one is quite a reputable scientific hypothesis. As for observation, the proximity of the sea makes it more than plausible that one should notice that the sun evaporates water, that mist rises from the surface to form clouds, which dissolve again in the form of rain. The earth, in this view, is a form of concentrated water. The detail might thus be fanciful enough, but it is still a handsome feat to have discovered that a substance remains the same in different states of aggregation. We see here that Thales, who popularly fell into a well while looking up at the stars, identified the ultimate fundamental element of the stuff of being as being water. Perhaps the most important thing that we take from Thales is the distinction from the mythos tradition, from the religious tradition, of the philosopher's openness to argument and criticism. Thales invited others to think on and improve upon his ideas, to challenge his ideas, And this remains a distinction of philosophy when it comes to belief is a willingness and openness to challenge, argue, and defend those beliefs, to have criticism of. So we think of Thales as the person who really introduced the idea of the critical tradition to philosophy. A student of Thales, Anaximander, proposed that water was not the basic building block of stuff, but there was something else, something more basic, something that was indefinite. He referred to it as the chaos. It was something smaller, a building block smaller than water itself, something that built water. He challenged his teacher, as his teacher Thales asked him to do, and he also proposed one of the first theories of evolution, which he claimed that fish came from a mixture of earth and water, and that humans came from fish. Heraclitus, who lived from 540 to 480 BCE, proposed that there was no fundamental solid stuff, that the thing that made everything up was a reaction. And as we know, that reaction is fire. Fire is a chemical reaction. Heraclitus was famous for saying, "It is impossible to step twice into the same river." What we see in Heraclitus is the first theory put forth in ancient Greek philosophy, which states that things appear to be stable, things appear to exist in being, but in fact they are becoming. They're in a constant state of flux. Things aren't hot or cold, they're either becoming hotter or colder in relation to some other point. Everything is defined from some other point. Life, death, winter, summer, up, down, hot, cold, sleeping, waking, night, day, these are all opposites that define one another from its polar opposite. Night defines day. Nothing is existing within isolation of itself. Now, this philosophy of becoming, maybe speaking in gerunds or verbs rather than in nouns. So thinking of a tree would be being. This is speaking as a noun, a tree. But if we say that it's something that is treeing, it's being treeness, it's treeing, now we're looking at something that's more becoming philosophy, something that's in transition. We're going to see this theme return again in postmodernism. The ancient Greek philosopher who is typically pitted against Heraclitus would be Parmenides. Parmenides was born in 515 BCE. And Parmenides proposed, in essence, the exact opposite of Heraclitus. And Parmenides said that everything was absolutely stable, that change was the illusion. There's one reality. It's all motionless. It exists. And we cannot rely on our senses to understand it, because our senses deceive us, as we know through illusions. Our senses deceive us. We must use logic. We must think in order to arrive at the reality. And this is what's called reason. We have to think. We have to reason. The mind is the most reliable source. Think, for instance, of experiencing the sun rising, the sun setting. To the sense organs, it appears as if the sun is actually rising or setting, when in fact the sun is stationary. This would be an example of privileging thinking over sensory data. So Parmenides, as Bertrand Russell points out in this excerpt, Parmenides' position very nicely. When you think of something. When you use a name, it must be of something. Therefore, both thought and language require objects outside themselves. And since you can think of a thing or speak of it at one time as well as another, whatever can be thought or spoken must exist at all times. Consequently, there can be no change.
since change consists in things coming into being and ceasing to be. This is the concept of reification. Reification is the idea that we can think something to a state of it being treated as if it actually exists. We discovered that earlier in a past lecture regarding traits. I'm Dr. Matthew Giobbi. Today we're going to be looking at the second installment of our second topic on psychology in ancient Greece. Let's begin with Zeno of Elea, another one of the pre-Socratics, the philosophers, the Greek thinkers who came before Socrates. Zeno of Elea lived from 495 to 430 BCE, and he's best known for descriptions from his fragment on what has come to be called Zenos Paradox. Zeno points out that if an archer fires an arrow towards a target, and that if we measure half of the distance between the archer and the target, and then half of that distance, and keep measuring the half distances that the arrow travels, that we will never arrive at a final point. We just keep measuring and breaking down halves into infinity. Therefore, Zeno concludes that motion is an illusion, much like virtual reality motion is today on our screens. Now, Zeno had a decision. His decision was to conclude that logic, mathematics, and reason were incorrect, or that sensory perception was incorrect. And he chose that sensory perception was illusory and could mislead us in our conclusions. This is a very important position in early philosophy. Listen to this. This is a typical major scale in Western music. Pythagoras in ancient Greece found that if he took one single string and plucked it, that it would produce a tone. If he then took that string and placed his finger directly in the center of it so that it would be halved and plucked each half, they would each make an octave higher. So the string plucked alone would sound like this. When halved, each half would sound like this. The same tone, one partial or one octave higher. If he then took those halves and halved them, they would produce this tone. That's a fifth higher, 5 notes higher than the original tone. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If you keep having these tones, Pythagoras found you'll come to every note that exists in a diatonic major scale. I'll do that again. Now, no doubt you've read or heard that music is very mathematical, and that's an example of how mathematics and physics is a part of music. the 8 tones of Western music is only one way of forming Western scales, and Chinese and Indian ragas have different ways of 24-tone microscales, and certain Japanese scales are 5-note scales. But Pythagoras, what's important here is that Pythagoras saw that there was an underlying mathematical ratio that existed in nature. Now, I want to point out this word ratio, as in rationality. Pythagoras became so entrenched in this thinking of mathematical laws and mathematical reality underlying the illusion of reality that we experience, that he actually started a mathematical cult, a cult of numbers. And people came from far away to worship mathematics and to see things geometrically rather than arithmetically. Arithmetic is something that has to do with numbers. Geometry has to do with ratios, relationships between things given meaning. What Pythagoras did was find some sort of accommodating theory between Heraclitus and Parmenides. Heraclitus' idea that things were always in flux would be Pythagoras' idea that we look at things through our senses. And Heraclitus' idea that things are always stable would be equivalent to Pythagoras' underlying mathematical ratios that serve as the true reality. The Pythagorean cult sought to question the illusion of sensory experience and to rely on rationality, ratios, and underlying mathematical reality. But the Pythagoreans felt that to get to this underlying reality, that one had to purify the mind, one had to sit in silence and meditate, and even restrict what their diet was. The Pythagoreans felt that certain foods interfered with thinking, one of which was fish, also beans, due to excessive flatulence, would interfere with good rational thought. Much of the thought of Plato and of Christian theology has similarities with this Pythagorean cult of life philosophy. For instance, Plato, on the entrance to the academy, had this printed: "Let no one without an understanding of mathematics enter here." We'll see many of the similar ideas of a mind a body and a soul, of a world here and another world elsewhere, another entity or realm elsewhere. We'll see these themes not only in Pythagoreanism, but also in the thinking of Plato and in the thinking in Christianity. We'll leave Plato with this consideration. The cult of mathematics that Pythagoras, and I do realize that I keep saying Plato, which is because there's such a strong link in my mind between Plato and Pythagoras, which we'll learn about later in a future talk. But we'll leave Pythagoras and the Pythagoreans with this. Their cult was very much like the Dionysian Orphic religion that we had discussed earlier. And it was also filled with many of the restrictions and conscientious acts that exist in Eastern philosophy, such as the Vedic religions and Buddhism. And in particular, here's an example. The Pythagoreans were vegetarians. They did not eat meat because they respected the soul of all living creatures. And they also had some peculiar rites and rituals, one of which seems to be a taboo against urinating towards the sun. Scholars haven't quite been able to work out why this was a taboo. Let's turn now to a student of Pythagoras, and that's Empedocles, who lived from 490 to 430 BCE. Empedocles felt that there were 4 elements, 4 things that made up existence, or all things, and these were earth, fire, air, and water, the 4 elements. Not only are these 4 elements the basic building blocks of everything physical, the physis, the stuff of what is, of being, he also claimed that there were two opposing forces, love and strife. Love brought things together, attracted things to one another, and strife pushed things apart. Love and strife and the four elements. Empedocles also claimed that he identified the underlying structure of everything in the cosmos in four phases. He said that in phase one, love, everything was brought together. Everything was a mixture and in harmony. In phase two, strife began to break things apart. And in stage three, things were in complete chaos. Strife had completely disorganized things into chaos. And into phase four, which things were again dominated by love, by coming together and reorganizing. And he said that this is the underlying theme of all things in nature, a four-phase structure of love and strife. This could also be seen in individuals. When love was predominant in an individual's sense of self, then they were seeking to join with others and to be peaceful. But when strife was within another individual, this showed through in their thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. This really was a theory of behavior and psychology. One of Empedocles' fragments sounds very familiar to the modern law of the conservation of energy. Listen to this fragment. From what does not exist, nothing can come into being, and for what exists, to be destroyed is impossible and unaccomplishable. This is very similar to the law of conservation and energy, which states that energy can take different forms, but neither be created nor destroyed. Empedocles also proposed an early form of theory of evolution, not like Anaximander. Although Empedocles' version was a little amusing. He claimed that during the moments of love, things came together in even very strange and bizarre ways. One of the fragments states that many necklace heads sprang up, naked arms wandered, devoid of shoulders, and eyes straight alone, begging for foreheads. Many grew double-headed, double-chested, man-faced oxen arose, and ox-headed men, creatures mixed partly from male, partly from female nature. And as they mingled, innumerable types of mortal things poured forth, fitted with every sort of shape, a wonder to see. So we see here that Empedocles felt that in this theory of evolution, that love brought things together, strife began to tear things apart until it went into a complete chaos, and then love brought things back together, attraction brought things back together again in a completely new way. We're going to see this theme repeat in postmodernity when we study structuralism and then a postmodern concept of post-structuralism with Jacques Derrida later in this course. Another interesting pre-Socratic thinker was Exaggerus. He lived from 500 to 428 BC. Maybe one of the most interesting things that he had to say was that everything was made up of the same stuff. But what made the thing become the thing it is was the predominant stuff that was in it. So everything, say, had wet in it, or dry in it, or hot or cold, or fire. Everything had these elements, these seeds in them. But some things had more of each component than the other. And the thing that it had the most of, it manifested as that thing. So fire would have most heat and dry as compared to water, which might be cold and wet or hot and wet. This is a very interesting worldview that Exaggerus took. Finally, we turn to Democritus, 460 to 370 BC. He is the last of the being philosophers, the cosmologists, the folks who are interested in what is the physis, what is the physics, the physical stuff that is made of. And Democritus came to a rather interesting conclusion. In 460 to 370 BCE, he claimed that the ultimate indivisible part of that stuff is made of is something called atomos, meaning atoms. and this means indivisible. So he said that the thing that is at the basis of everything are things called atoms. Everything is made up of these atoms, and some of the atoms have different things, can take on different sizes and shapes, and they can have different locations and numbers, but the ultimate stuff is this indivisible thing called an atom. Now, look, we're talking now 2,500 years ago. The theory of atoms is put forth. Now, the reason that this is so important for us to consider is that Democritus put forth a theory that even claimed that mental events could be reduced to very fast fire atoms of mental experience. The thinking was atomic at some level. This is fascinating. This shows two of the basic foundational principles of modern biological psychology, elementism and reductionism. So elementism is the idea that things can be broken down into elements. Matter is broken down into basic concepts. And reductionism is the idea that things, the higher structures like thinking and mental events, can be understood as being reduced down to atomic, or in contemporary terms, neurotransmitter or biological genetic components. And Democritus put thinking solidly in the brain, and he placed the emotions in the heart, where we feel the emotions. Hi, I'm Dr. Matthew Giobbi. I'm investigating the history of psychology from about 15,000 BCE to tomorrow. This is the third installment of our investigation of ancient Greek philosophy. We'll be beginning today with a look at Hippocrates, the biological psychologist, and a thorough discussion of the predecessors to contemporary postmodern continental thought, the Sophists. Ancient Greek philosophy, from Hippocrates through the Sophists. You're probably familiar with the Hippocratic oath that doctors take, a pledge not to harm their patients in any way. That oath comes from someone in ancient Greece, a physician named Hippocrates. He lived from 460 to 377 BCE. Now, why Hippocrates is so important to contemporary psychology and psychiatry is that he was one of the first to develop a biological theory of mental illnesses, of psychological phenomenon. And Hippocrates, and later in the Roman Empire, Galen, 130 to 200 CE, developed the four humors theory. And Hippocrates and Galen proposed that there were four basic fluids in the body, and when these fluids were in balance, the person was content and happy and harmonious. When they were out of balance, the person was in discord. They were inharmonious. So we have phlegm, blood, yellow bile, and black bile. This is Galen's final shaping of the Hippocratic theory. We have phlegm, blood, yellow bile, and black bile. Now, someone who has too much phlegm would have a phlegmatic personality, a phlegmatic temperament, which means they're sluggish and unemotional, kind of like we call today flat affect. Someone who had too much blood would be called a sanguine temperament, sanguine personality. This would be someone who's cheerful. We might today even describe this as someone who's manicky. Yellow bile We call this person choleric. They have a choleric personality or a choleric temperament, and they're usually quick-fired and tempered, what today we might describe as anxious or anxiety, prone to explosive anxiousness. And then finally, black bile, which is a melancholic temperament. And this is someone who's sad. Obviously, today, someone who would be diagnosed with some sort of depressive disorder. Now, if the pre-Socratic philosophers we've been looking at were interested in getting to the ultimate big T truth of what is the physis, what is the physics, what is the stuff that, the ultimate stuff that everything can be broken down to, the agenda for another group of philosophers was a little different. These philosophers were called the sophists. And the sophists were interested in, as we see sophists, wisdom. They weren't interested in big T truths. As a matter of fact, they challenged that big T ultimate universal truths even exist. And instead were interested in exploring how we come to believe in something called truth. What are the structures through language and through thought? How does logic and reason and mathematics shape what we see as big T truth? So the sophists really had a different agenda. They were philosophers that did not believe in universality. They believed in relativity. So universal truth, I like to refer to as to some other philosophers, such as Cornel West, as big T truths, big T truth rather. And the relativist claim I like to call little t, the lowercase t, truths. This means that truth can exist within a structure of knowledge, but big T universal truths, overriding grand narrative truths, are an illusion. Now this is the real crux of the difference between the pre-Socratic and ancient Greek philosophers we're going to see from Socrates, Plato, through Aristotle, and the sophists. We're going to explore three sophists. The most famous is Pythagoras, Gorgias, and we're also going to look at Xenophanes. Now, if you're taking an introduction to philosophy course, you could learn that the sophists were not, quote-unquote, real philosophers, that they were something like lawyers or people who charged money to learn how the tricks of making anything sound correct. And you could also have a professor or a textbook that introduces the sophists as philosophers who were not so much tricksters as they are believers in relative truth rather than universal truth. We now understand that there are two perspectives on this. I take the position that the sophists were critics of universal truth and explored how in epistemology, how language and logic and the rules of thinking shape what we call big T truths. And that's how we're going to approach the sophists in our discussion. If we had a representative from the ancient Greeks for contemporary cognitive psychology and neuroscience, it might be Pythagoras. Pythagoras, in one of his fragments, wrote, "Man is the measure of all things, of the things that are and the things that they are, and of what things are not and what they are not." What we see here is the cognitive view of understanding things through cognitive framing, through the framework of our beliefs, change the way we view things. You want to change the way you see something, change the way you think about it or what you believe about it. If Heraclitus said we can never step into the same river twice, Protagoras famously quipped, "Man never steps into the same river once." This is an illustration of how much our perceptual tools, our mind, our body plays a role in the shaping of reality and the shaping of what is. When we put words to something, the rhetoric of language, we put word to something, when we label it, it becomes stable. The river. The river is not something that is stable in all of its facets. It is, as Protagoras points out, impossible to step into the same river even once. It's constantly flowing. If I look out my window at the Delaware River, this is something we call the Delaware River. We refer to it. We know as a geographic place where it is. but the Delaware River is changing moment by moment. It's never the same river even once, certainly not twice. Sophists show us the role of rhetoric in thinking and in knowledge. Well, let's take a very simple example that is used today, talking about the rhetoric of science. As you all know, if you write a scientific paper in the social sciences, at least, we're required to use the third person. This is academic language. We, one, not the first person of I. The first person of I gives an individual subjective impression of what one is discussing. Terms like we have investigated, or if one considers, gives a feeling of objectivity, of emotional removal from the information. You can express the same information as in the first person I, or in the third person one and we, and it will have two different rhetorical effects. When you read a scientific journal and it's written in the third person, it feels somehow more objective, more scientific, somehow more objectively, emotionally removed. When we write in the first person, it feels like we're involved subjectively with it. Same information can be expressed in two completely different ways. This is what we call the rhetoric of science. And this is exactly what the sophists taught, how to use rhetoric to shape your argument and to come to truth claims. So where Pythagoras is going to end up with this, as do the other sophists, if truth and falsehood is relative to given systems of knowledge, to different rules, if there is no definite truth, there is no definite falsehood, then what do we do? How can we make any useful claims about anything? Well, the sophists say something about this that is going to reinvest itself in psychology in 1890 with William James, and that is, we don't look at ultimate truths or relative truths as something that are true and we bow to them, but we look at the usefulness of truthful statements. Therefore, Pythagoras and the other sophists claim that we aren't concerned with what is true. Something that is true is something that works, and when it stops working, it ceases to be true. And this is a theme that that becomes popular in American philosophy in the 19th century, called pragmatism. We can think of Gorgias, who lived 485 to 380 BCE, as an extreme sophist. This is a fellow who claimed that there is absolutely no way of measuring objective truth. This is what we call nihilism. He also claimed that we create reality subjectively. This is a concept in philosophy called solipsism. This is the idea that all of reality is something that exists within us. So this is a very extreme form of sophism. And of course, the link with language is that for Gorgias, as with other sophists, rhetoric and language, the structure of language, grammar, determines what we believe, what we know is true and real. And this is a theme that once again is going to return with the postmodern thinkers, with the postmodern psychologists and theorists of the 1970s and 1980s. Now, this relativist nature of truth was antithetical, was the complete opposite of what the other philosophers were thinking, ultimate big T truth. We're looking at people like Plato and Aristotle and Socrates. The goal, all the way up through until Kant, the goal of philosophy was to get at the big T truths through logic, through reason, or through rationality, thinking, or empiricism through the senses. Science will become the philosophy of empiricism. Empiricism is the underlying philosophy of the scientific method through the senses, measuring and observing. Rationality, thinking, is the underlying methodology and belief system of what today we would refer to as the philosophy departments, although philosophy departments also have empiricists, but those empiricist philosophers typically became scientists. The sophists, this branch of thinkers, is now in literary theory. It's in certain branches of psychology, such as some cognitive psychologists and neuroscientists, and as well as some psychoanalysts and existential phenomenological psychologists. We really have this debate that goes on through the history of psychology. Now, the sophists were highly, highly criticized by our next two philosophers, and that's Socrates and Plato, and also Aristotle, although Aristotle was more concerned with other things, but Socrates and Plato were very harsh critics of the sophists. In an interesting way, Socrates himself embraced much of the sophistic ideology, as we'll see. So it's a bit of a paradox that Socrates did what the sophists did, but was also very critical of the sophists, which perhaps makes him either the ultimate sophist or a severe critic of the sophists. You can decide as we explore Socrates and Plato in our next segment. As we'll see, the sophists will make a return. The return comes with Nietzsche. In the 19th century, we'll be looking at philosophers such as Friedrich Nietzsche, Arthur Schopenhauer, eventually going into Martin Heidegger and the existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre, Albert Camus, Proust. These individuals then feeding into contemporary postmodern thinkers such as Jacques Derrida and Jean Baudrillard. We'll be looking at these individuals and how the sophists were the main lineage from the past to the post-present. When we think of ancient Greece and the ancient Greek philosophers, three names typically come to mind: Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Today, we are going to discuss these three figures of the golden age of ancient Greece and enter our way into the upcoming event called the Roman Empire. Socrates lived in ancient Greece from 470 BCE through 399 BCE. He was actually put to death by the government, and this was because he was accused of corrupting the youth of Athens. Now, what happened here is very interesting, because Socrates, it was claimed by many, including the Oracle of Delphi, that there was no one wiser than Socrates in all of Greece. And Socrates went on a quest to find out if this was in fact true, if there was no one wiser than he. So he would go around the Agora, the city circle, the center square of Athens, and he would question people to see what they knew. And Socrates is in the habit of doing something what we call inductive definition, and this would be the idea of asking questions about what is beauty, what is just, what is truth. He would ask these questions and people would give their answers, and he'd say, well, can you think of what qualities all things beautiful hold? And he used this way of trying to get at what he called the essence of something, the essence of, say, truth, or the essence of beauty. And as it turned out, no one could ever get to it. In fact, he could never get to it. but he met a lot of people who thought they really knew what things were. And he came to the conclusion that the difference between himself and others was that they thought they knew something, and he knew he did not know something. So he concluded, and what has been the conclusion, that the oracle at Delphi was saying that Socrates was the wisest man in ancient Greece because he was aware that he didn't know anything. Now, this is very interesting to think about because it really distinguishes something that's very important for all of us. We've talked about intellectual humility. Well, I believe intellectual humility is expressed this way. It's the difference between knowing and thinking. Someone who knows has become stagnant. They know, they've settled in. They're not looking any longer. They know. Now they know. Knowledge is something like a commodity that can be held. This is much different than thinking. Thinking is an activity. Knowing is an end. But thinking is something that's ongoing. It's an activity. And I think this is a very important distinction that's being described here by Socrates. Socrates was a thinker, not a knower. Socrates was also a bit annoying. He earned the nickname of the gadfly because he did go around questioning everyone, and it became very frustrating. People didn't want to question everything they believed in or everything they felt. But when Socrates started questioning big institutions such as the government and economics and political systems, and the youth of Athens started to admire his questioning and started to question it themselves, that's when the government became concerned. And at 70 years old, they sentenced him to death. Now, he had every opportunity to escape. His friends came to visit him in the prison. There was a delay in his execution due to a religious holiday when no executions were permitted to take place. It's thought that the government officials even urged him to escape because they were embarrassed that they were killing this public figure at 70 years old. And there's one thing that we must always keep in mind. Socrates refused to escape. He refused to leave Athens. It's been said that he loved Athens so much that he couldn't bear being outside of Athens. But I think what we really are seeing here is Socrates' almost obsessive commitment to what is just and to ethics. Socrates felt and believed that the conclusion that was come to for his execution was a just conclusion, and that it was ethical for him to follow through with it. And this is what we really take from Socrates, his interest in ethics, his interest in justice, and his interest in commitment to honor. There's a sketch, a tiny postcard, that actually prompted the postmodern writer Jacques Derrida to write an essay and entitle a book called The Postcard. And this postcard is a Middle Ages, a medieval postcard from the Middle Ages, and it depicts Plato whispering into the ear of Socrates as Socrates writes. So this postcard is peculiar. And it's peculiar because we have nothing written by Socrates. In fact, Socrates, although he did exist as an historical figure, Socrates never wrote anything down. All he did was talk with people. One of those individuals he spoke with and apparently became quite fascinated with Socrates and learned from him was Plato. Plato featured Socrates as the character in his writings, and that's how we know of Socrates. So this postcard is illustrating something very philosophical, a turn on itself, in which Plato is actually telling Socrates what to write, the act of writing becoming the act of authoritative or authorship in the ideas. Now we wonder, why did Plato not write in his own voice? Why did not Plato say I or we or one? Instead, Plato wrote a series of dialogues in which Socrates was featured as the protagonist of these dialogues. Well, some believe that this was done to protect himself. He didn't want to be placed in a position where the government would turn on him and would execute him. He could always say, well, I didn't say this. This is what Socrates said. I am simply just repeating and putting down what Socrates said. This isn't Plato. This is Socrates. This is a very important thing to consider. This is exactly why we understand Nietzsche's description of those philosophers that came before Socrates, not as pre-Socratics, but as pre-Platonics. So Plato, the student of Socrates, the friend of Socrates, lived from 427 to 347 BCE. And academics, researchers, scholars of philosophy often divide Plato's work and life into two sections. The first section is the time that he was with Socrates, the time that he wrote much of the thoughts and reported much of the thoughts of his teacher Socrates. Then when Socrates passed, when Socrates died, Plato escaped. He went into self-imposed exile in southern Italy. And this is where he met the Pythagoreans. Now you may recall in a previous episode that I was discussing Pythagoras and I would say Plato. Well, this is exactly why. Now you understand this. This is because Plato became very much influenced by the Pythagoreans, very much influenced by the idea of mathematical representation of ultimate reality. Now this is the birth of geometry. Geometry was invented in order to discuss this ultimate realm of reality that was in ratios that Plato described. He called it the real, the ideal forms. And we can think of this as a realm that's almost like the heaven, a dwelling place where everything is perfect. And Plato felt that everything here was a mere copy of the real forms that existed in heaven. So we have these ideals, these images that exist, these forms that exist in heaven that don't exist here on earth. For instance, we see the sun, and we think the sun is a circle or a sphere, but there is actually no perfect circle or no perfect sphere in nature. There's no perfectly straight line in nature. There are no squares, rectangles, or triangles perfectly formed in nature. They're all mere bastardized reproductions of the concept of triangular, square, rectangular, and circular. And these forms, the geometric forms in their perfectness, existed in the heavenly realms. This is an illustration of how we can understand geometry as philosophy. Geometry is philosophy. Now, imagine if we taught today geometry in a philosophical way, a way of understanding philosophical, geometrical thinking in relationships of meaning. This is very, very insightful and powerful to think about. So if Socrates were seeking out the essence, something he never arrived at, Plato was saying that the essence was this thing called the form. So as you know, Plato's writings fill volumes. We are going to concentrate on 5 things. I'd like to just introduce 5 basic big picture ideas of Plato. The first will be the analogy of the divided line. The second's the allegory of the cave. The third will be the reminiscence theory of knowledge. Fourth will be his idea of the soul, of personality. We'll then look at sleep and dreams. And this will be serving as a basic overview of Platonic theory. So in the Republic, we find Plato's analogy of the divided line, and what he was really giving here is a nature of knowledge, of knowing. And he says at the bottom of the line, the lowest form of knowing, of knowledge, is imagining, and it's through images, imagining. And the next closer to the forms, to the ideal truth, it would be visible things, like things that are visible. We can hold beliefs about these visible things. Next is mathematical figures, mathematical objects. This is thinking. This is the highest in the human form that we can get to, the mathematical objects in the intelligible world. But then the highest area of knowledge, what true knowledge is, would be in the forms, in these forms that exist outside of the intelligible world. And of all the forms, the greatest form, the one form that encapsulates all the other forms, is the form called the good. It's the good. So we go from imagination to belief, to thinking, to knowledge, to intelligence. And each of those correspond with images, visible things, mathematical operations, forms, and the idea of the good, the ultimate form of all forms. So if we think about what Plato's saying here, if we encounter a poet or a painter, someone who makes images, makes imitation copies, fake copies on a canvas or on a sketch pad, or words that conjure up images as the poet does, but aren't those real images themselves, Plato claims that these people can lead us astray in our thinking. We can believe in these things as if they're real, but they're in fact mere inaccurate copies of the forms. They're not even physical objects of the things themselves. So we have to really be aware of this hierarchy of things in the Republic. The Republic is actually Plato's idea of a utopian world, his rules and laws, in which a utopian world government would exist, and he claimed that poets and artists would be banned from the Republic because they were giving out inaccurate, the lowest form of information. I'm sure that he would have allowed the mathematicians, the philosopher kings, to be a part of the Republic. In the Republic, Plato also discusses the allegory of the cave. This is perhaps the best known allegory of Plato. And Plato asks us to imagine a cave, underground cave, and that there are individuals there that have lived there their entire lives, and they're chained and shackled as prisoners in a way that they are looking toward a distant wall. Now, they can only look in one direction, and that's towards this distant wall. They're unable to look behind them, to see behind them. What is behind them are people who are not slaves, but individuals who are presenting objects, teaching them, and showing the objects which are casting shadows onto the wall in front of them. So you have, say, an individual walking behind the prisoners, allowing an object to cast a shadow from a fire that's behind all of them onto the far wall, and they are naming these objects on the wall. And individuals see these different shaped objects on the wall, these shadows, but to them they're not shadows, these are the real things themselves. And Plato says that this is the lowest form of knowledge. This is like the images. These are the lowest form. This is the lowest form of knowledge. And Plato asks us to imagine that somehow one of the prisoners becomes able to turn around to see the object itself and the fire of course would burn the individual's eyes, blind them with brightness. But seeing that object itself would be akin to the visible things of the world of appearances. And the other prisoners might say that the individual's crazy, might say, how could you think such a thing? Reality is clearly in front of us. And in fact, the other prisoners are only seeing mere shadows. Plato then asks us to imagine that somehow this prisoner sets himself free, and they're able to not only see the object itself and the light, the burning fire, but also to escape the cave and go up and see not only mathematical representation, but the ideal forms. And the sun would blind them and it would hurt their eyes, and they'd want to turn back to the comfort of the known that they grew up with. And if this individual would return back to the cave, which Plato says would be a necessary just thing for this prisoner to do, to go back and liberate the other prisoners, to return back to the cave, his fellow prisoners would call him crazy, and it would be difficult for the freed prisoner to ever accept or take anything seriously in the cave any longer, realizing that it's a mere shadow, mere appearance. Well, of course, this is a story of human knowledge. We are the prisoners. What we think and are so convinced is reality is a mere shadow of reality. And every once in a while, one of us breaks free and sees something that the others don't. We turn around and we contemplate, and often those individuals are ridiculed and called crazy and ridiculous, and it's also a very painful thing to do. And Plato says, if once we achieve this, we become the philosopher kings, and it's our duty to go back down into the cave and teach others the lessons that we've learned. So this is the allegory of the cave Plato mentions in the Republic. There are two models that Plato discusses regarding the soul and personality and character. The first I'll describe is Plato's idea that we, of character type, of personality, that on a broadest sense, we all exist as one of three basic personality types. That's an individual who lives from the gut, the bronze personality. This is a person who lives from their appetite, their desire, for hunger, for sex, for pleasure, things of this nature. Living from the stomach, in other words, enjoys eating. This is a bronze personality. The silver personality, this is a person who lives from their chest. They live for pride. These are the individuals who, in our culture, become decorated and military folks and hold titles and things of this nature. This is prideful, elected officials, things of this. And then the supreme person lives from their head. This is the golden personality, or the philosopher king. This is an individual who studies mathematics and philosophy. And Plato describes these three basic forms of personality as the bronze, silver, and gold personality. The goal is to turn bronze and silver into gold, a sort of hermetic alchemy, which later Carl Jung will base his entire system of psychotherapy on, turning individuals with bronze and silver desire into gold desire. Also in the Republic, Book 7, Plato discusses what's known as the golden chariot. Plato said that we are all of us individually, our personality structures are like a chariot driver. And that chariot is pulled by two horses, one dark, lascivious, desiring horse, and the other a righteous, prideful, rule-bound, righteous horse. And each of these horses wants to go in a different direction, and it's the job of the chariot driver to keep them both satisfied, to keep them both moving in a direction to satisfy equally. Of course, we know that Freud copied this model in his theory of the psyche as well, with the id, the ego, and the superego. The id being the lascivious horse, the superego being the righteous horse of culture and social rules, and the ego being the chariot driver.